For Creamer Media's Polity, I am Shannon de Rehove. Authors Greg Mills and Jeffrey Herbst join me to discuss their latest book, How South Africa Works and Must Do Better. The overwhelming challenge that South Africa faces and has to date failed to address is unemployment, especially among African youth. Are the economic imperatives for employment and growth reconcilable with those for transformation and redress?
I think absolutely, and they certainly have to be. I believe that if we're going to build the sort of South Africa that we want to, it can only be done sustainably through unemployment. I mean, the government has been enormously successful at addressing poverty at the sort of bottom end of the pile over the past 21 years, which is the period that the book covers. But that's largely been through welfare and through a redistributive element. That, of course, is not sustainable in the long run, and ideally we don't want it to be sustainable in the long run because it's not about redistribution in the manner in which we want to build our society. It's really about giving people a place where they're working, they have a trajectory for themselves. Those are the foundations of an inclusive society. One has to argue about how successful BEE schemes have been in this process. Certainly it's created a new black elite, but it hasn't reached as far down perhaps as its architects would initially have hoped for. The way we're going to do that over the long term is by reducing that 1/3 of our society who are currently unemployed and the 70% or so of our youth who are unemployed.
What are the tough choices confronting a developing economy to lift itself out of poverty into a globally competitive player?
And I think it's sometimes forgotten that South Africa had something of a double whammy in 1994. Not only did we have to change from apartheid to democracy, of course, with all the positive elements that were attached to that, but we also had to go from an economic system that was largely isolated from the global economy, protected behind high tariff walls. The global economy itself was, of course, divided between East and West, to one that was increasingly integrated globally, and our own economy had to be integrated in terms of competitiveness and its own strategies within that wider global economy. So it was this double whammy of political and economic change. And at the same time, the world moved from labor-intensive industries, low-wage industries, to increasing capital intensity and technology intensity and economies of scale, which meant, of course, there was less demand for people in the sort of lower end of the employment margins. So we've had to undertake many simultaneous transitions, and that, of course, is mitigated against creating employment on the scale that we're really required to do so in South Africa, also to meet people's aspirations.
The book illustrates how South Africa could work so much better if its considerable human potential were to be liberated by economic reform. What suggestions are put forward for this to be realized?
Well, Shannon, you're absolutely right that the book that we wrote, How South Africa Works and Must Do Better, does identify that there is a tremendous reservoir of entrepreneurial talent in South Africa. And part of South Africa's opportunity is it has a private sector that really could expand and generate a large number of employment opportunities. But a lot of work has to be done if people are going to invest their capital, their time, and really their lives building these firms. I think most of all, we feel that government has to have a laser-like focus on growth and in particular employment. Examples from other countries, especially in East Asia, indicate that there are different paths to prosperity, but one of the commonalities is that countries focus for generations on how to create jobs, how to create employment. We also identify significant structural barriers to increasing employment in South Africa. Government policies, whether conscious or not, have had the effect of incentivizing employers often to use more capital-intensive methods, and that's an especial concern now because technology means that with robotics and computers, that there are a lot of machines out there that could replace people. The minimum wage legislation and how it works across sectors means that South Africa has a very high minimum wage, especially for entrants. And if you compare new workers in South Africa to the salaries that new workers get in other countries, they're paid much more. Now that's good for the people who actually get jobs, but it means that the very large number of people who are not employed are unlikely to be employed. Labor legislation is also means that it's very hard for employers to manage their workforce, to change workers, to move people around, to do reductions in force if necessary. And that, once again, protects existing workers, but it means that employers are, quite frankly, very scared of hiring workers because they're afraid that they'll be stuck, as it were, with a workforce that's inappropriate for a particular circumstance. And we know from worldwide experience that if employers are not confident that they can manage their workforces, they won't hire people, they'll hire machines. We also believe that much more has to be done to shore up the underpinnings of South Africa's economy. The parastatals, Eskom notably, but also several others, have to work better. The ports, the harbors, the roads must work much better in order for South African firms to be competitive. And finally, there are a large number of sectoral policies that we identify. The book looks at agriculture, manufacturing, services, and mining, and identifies specific issues in each that have to be addressed. For instance, in agriculture, we believe that there's been an overemphasis on land redistribution and on land ownership, because if you look at worldwide trends in agriculture, it's actually about increasing productivity per hectare. And that's the real question, and that's what South African farmers are asking. It's not so much who owns how much land, but what they're doing with it. In the services sector, which has the potential to generate a large number of jobs, South Africa has also adopted policies, for instance the visa policy, that seem to deter people from investing. So there's a lot that must be done, but we feel if it is done, the returns will be very high.
How South Africa Works presents intriguing findings about how South African businesses are squaring up to local and global challenges. Please elaborate on some of the proposals you suggest overcoming these challenges.
Well, again, we believe that part of it is government policy, part of it is national policy, part of it is infrastructure policy, part of it is sectoral policy, but we don't let business or labor off the hook either. Government must lead. And if government policy is not in the right place to create an enabling environment, nothing else is going to happen. But government policy in many ways is a necessary but not sufficient condition. We also believe that business must do much more. We profoundly agree that business has to have a profit incentive to invest. South Africa is not going to change the economic laws of gravity. If there are not profitable opportunities out there, businessmen, black or white, are not going to invest in this country. However, we also found, when looking at firms nationwide, that companies can do a lot to have the stable and productive workforce which they say they want. Some of the employers, for instance, told us that they pay much more than the minimum wage, that they invest considerably on a voluntary basis in their communities, because basically you get the workforce that you deserve. And if you pay the absolute minimum and don't invest, especially if you're a mine or a location where there's very little other economic activity, then the workers will not have much dedication or loyalty. You'll see strikes and other activity. We also believe that business has to take much greater role in technical training. That's absolutely critical in this country. The educational system has to be addressed. There's widespread recognition of that. But there's also a role for business in providing more skills training, and it should take on that role directly. Business and government also have to find a better way of talking with each other. You have a lot of fora for discussions. We don't think they're working. And we find that people are just talking right past each other. The discussions in both agriculture and mining, for instance, concerning property rights, who owns what land, who owns what mines, has been, characterized by a failure to reach a common ground, and instead the parties just talking completely past each other. Government has to be involved, but so does business. Finally, labor has a role in this also. South Africa has a very high level of strike activity right now, one of the highest in terms of person days lost for strikes in the world, much higher in fact than in the late 1980s when there were rolling actions in partially commercial, partially political. No one's going to invest in a country, as one of our respondents said, where miners go on strike for 5 months. It's just not going to happen. And labor has to recognize that beyond the particular workers it represents at any one time, that it also has responsibilities to workers at large or potential workers and to society at large. It's not going to help COSATU or any of the other labor unions if the workforce continues to age. It's actually fairly old right now, and if new workers are not taken on, yes, they'll preserve the wages of the existing workers, but eventually that'll be a situation which was far from desirable, even according to labor's own lights. So in addition to the government policies we identify, both labor and business must step up.
Your book puts forward clear-cut solutions to South Africa's challenges. How likely is it that the book and these solutions will be read by South Africa's leaders and implemented?
Well, we have been struck, I think, in a very positive way in how timely these debates are. We know from discussions with government leaders, with ANC officials, that there's a clear recognition of the economic challenges facing South Africa. What to do about them is hard. And the situation in South Africa is very serious: structural unemployment, low economic growth, lack of economic transformation of the structure of the economy. If there were simple solutions, frankly, I think they would have been adopted already. These are things which require significant political will as well as technical expertise. What you don't need is any more economic plans, because we document, and it's well known, that there have been a whole series of reports, plans, discussion documents for the last 20 years, many of them quite good in terms of words on paper, but they're not executed. And so not only do you have to have the political will and adopt policies, but you have to be able to execute. And that's perhaps where the government has fallen down most likely. We believe that this is a good moment for discussion of these issues and an opportune time for South Africa to go on a new growth path, because the economics and politics have aligned. One of the arguments that we make in the book is that the poor economy, and especially unemployment, is hurting the ANC's own long-term electoral chances. It's not that people at the moment are voting against the ANC. What they're doing is standing on the sidelines and not voting at all. And the absolute number of people who are supporting the ANC is down considerably over the last 20 years, even though the population continues to rise. They're just not voting. That's a reservoir of potential voters that will eventually be mobilized by someone. It can be the ANC, or it can be a competitor to the ANC. So we argue that not only are the economic policies suggested good for the country, but in terms of ANC's own political chances, very important. And we also argue for labor, that a diminishing workforce in some ways, and certainly a workforce that is getting older, is just not in labor's interests. So it seems that the stars have aligned in terms of the economic possibilities and the political imperatives. Whether leaders take on those policies remains to be seen. We document lots of countries that essentially knew what to do but didn't do it. So at the end of the day, these are choices that South Africans have to make.
During the process of writing this book, you interviewed hundreds of companies and entrepreneurs around South Africa. How did you go about doing this? Which companies and entrepreneurs specifically stick in your mind? And how can the book help business owners tackle the challenges facing South African businesses?
You know, writing a book is like a little bit like starting a snowball. So, you know, you meet one person and that leads to meeting other people and so on and so forth. But we were interested in looking not just at one sector or just at the economy overall, but in dividing it up between mining and agriculture and services and other elements as well, and of course notably industry, given it's such an important employer. And by, you know, literally meeting people would lead to other people. And we also attempted not just to go to Johannesburg, where we're based, but to cover the entire country as much as possible in the process. So the journey of fieldwork took us literally from Kakamas to Cape Town, from the Makatini Flats up in the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal to Wilsonia in East London, visiting many of the former industrial border areas, for example, and seeing what's happened there and why that's happened there, whether this can be turned around, and seeing firsthand for ourselves and listening to the experiences of people who've been involved in these processes in order to understand what we could advise and what the book suggests in its conclusion. I think the remarkable thing out of all of this is that there are many people still making money in South Africa. There are very many successful entrepreneurs. There's many who've made the transition from that old isolated apartheid economy to a new, modern, more competitive one. The issue that we really describe in the book is what would happen if we provided better conditions, a better policy environment for such businesses. We'd have probably many more of them, and they'll be operating at a grander and greater scale. So there are many successful South Africans out there. We were hugely impressed in meeting a large number of them. And I think the book is about providing the right policy situation, the right policy context to ensure that they are greater in number and that they can create the sort of jobs that South Africa needs.
Which countries knew what needed to be done and implemented these changes?
The book looks at, on a comparative basis, at a whole range of countries in the first 21 years, against countries like Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, from the first 21 years of their independence. So in Singapore's case, from 1965 to 1986. And South Africa, of course, in its own 21-year period of history. Our economy has grown, our per capita income has grown by 30% over our 21 years. In the case of Singapore, it was over 500%. In the case of Vietnam and Malaysia, very similar amounts. Huge increases, multifold increases in per capita income, demonstrating to people that there were real dividends from political liberation. And I think that goes to the heart of what the challenge is for South Africa and for the government in South Africa, is that we know more or less what to do. We know more or less what the technical requirements of change are. We know more or less what the financial implications of transformation are. But it's whether we are able to make the political changes and use the political mandate and take some of the political costs that are inherent in those changes and in those decisions. That is the big challenge for South Africa. So we've had the National Growth Path, the National Development Plan, and earlier time ASGISA and GEAR and the RDP. We've had lots of plans which have come to the consensual conclusion as to what South Africa has to do. What we lack is the political wherewithal to make difficult decisions, to stick by those decisions, and to accept the consequences, both good and bad, in political terms. We still, to a very great extent, live under the illusion, according to the mythology, of the alliance that brought liberation to this country in 1994, and we want to maintain that sense of solidarity. The cost is progress on the policy front, and the cost is in terms of our economic liberation.
That was author Greg Mills and author Jeffrey Herbst speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about their latest book, How South Africa Works and Must Do Better.